They told me marriage would prevent a war, not that it would start one inside my own home. My father called it a gift to our people. I called it a sentence, though I never said the word out loud, because a princess of the Ashwin Dominion does not complain about duty, even when duty wears the face of a stranger from a planet we had barely bothered to study. His name was Daniel Cole, a human, one of billions on a small blue world that had only just learned we existed, and that already, somehow, held enough leverage to make my father nervous. I did not understand the leverage. I understood only that our fleet had lost 3 ships testing the edges of human space, quietly, without explanation, and that afterward my father stopped speaking of humanity as a curiosity and started speaking of them as a variable he could not predict. A variable he wanted inside the family, where he could watch it. That was me, the variable's keeper. I met Daniel for the first time in a room built for treaties, not for people. Gray walls, long table, advisors on both sides pretending to smile. He walked in wearing something plain, something that did not shine or announce rank the way our formal robes did, and I remember thinking he looked unprepared, almost apologetic. He had brown hair, tired eyes, and hands that fidgeted slightly when the translator device on his wrist clicked on. I decided, in that first minute, that he was nothing to fear. I decided wrong, though it would take me a long time to understand how wrong. "I'm told I'm supposed to bow," he said, through the translator, and then he did, badly, off balance, catching himself on the edge of the table. A few of my father's advisors laughed behind their hands. I did not laugh. I watched his face turn red, watched him straighten up and say, "I'll get better at that," with a small, crooked smile, like the mistake did not truly bother him. I did not know yet that humans smiled that way, even when something bothered them a great deal. I had a lot to learn about humans. I had a lot to learn about him. The negotiations took 4 days. I sat through most of them, technically present as the Dominion's future consort, though no one asked my opinion on anything that mattered. They discussed trade corridors, communication protocols, and the boundaries of contact between our species. Daniel sat on the human side of the table, mostly quiet, occasionally saying something short and practical that made the arguing stop faster than anything my father's chancellor said in an hour of speeches. On the second day, one of our military advisors, a stiff, proud man named Sereth, tried to push a clause that would have given the Dominion inspection rights over human colony ships. Daniel listened to the whole proposal without interrupting. Then he said simply, "No." Just that. No elaboration, no anger, no raised voice. Sereth pressed him, asked what authority he had to refuse on behalf of his entire species. Daniel said, "The kind that comes from already having lost people to inspections that turned into something else. We're not doing that again, not with anyone." The room went quiet. My father watched him with new interest, the kind he usually reserved for weapons he had not yet tested. I remember feeling something shift in my chest, some small unease, though I told myself it was nothing. A human being firm was still a human being, still soft, still slow compared to us, still fragile compared to us, still, in every way I understood strength, small. I held on to that belief for longer than I should have. By the 4th day, the treaty was drafted, and my father presented the final condition with the ease of a man announcing the weather: a marriage, between his daughter and the human delegate who had, apparently, impressed him more than anyone expected. I did not gasp. I did not argue in front of the room. I had been raised knowing that a Corvain does not display weakness where enemies or allies can see it, and I did not know yet which category the humans belonged to. But my hands went cold under the table, and I looked at Daniel to see how he would react. He looked, for a moment, just as startled as I felt. Then he glanced at me, not at my father, not at the room, at me, and asked, quietly enough that only I could hear through the translator, "Is this something you want, or something you're being told to want?" No one had asked me that question in my entire life. I did not answer him honestly. I said the treaty was good for both our peoples, and that duty mattered more than preference. He nodded slowly, like he understood exactly what I had not said, and did not push further. Later that night, after the humans had returned to their transport and the Dominion advisors had gone to celebrate a treaty they considered a triumph, I stood on the balcony outside my chambers and looked at the sky, at the small blue star that human ships had come from, and wondered what kind of life I was being handed. I imagined weakness. I imagined patience. I imagined a husband who would need protecting, who would flinch at the sight of our wildlife, who would require translators for every joke and every insult, who would be, in every sense that mattered to my people, harmless. I was half right. He did flinch, once, at a void spider that wandered into our garden during our first month together, and he made a sound that I later learned was called a yelp, and he apologized for it immediately afterward, embarrassed, laughing at himself before I could laugh at him. He was clumsy with our customs. He mispronounced half the honorifics. He asked questions that revealed, painfully, how little his species understood about mine, and I found myself, more than once, correcting him gently instead of coldly, which surprised me more than it should have. He cooked, badly, insisting on preparing human meals for both of us, despite having no idea which of our native ingredients were safe to combine. The first time, he nearly poisoned us both with a spice that reacted badly with something in his own biology, and he laughed about it afterward instead of being ashamed, said something about how, at least dying together this early would make a good story, and I remember staring at him, unable to decide if I found the joke horrifying or endearing. He was easy to be around. That was the part I had not expected. Easy in a way none of my own kind had ever been, because none of my own kind spoke to me without calculating what my response might cost them politically. Daniel simply talked. About his family, small details, a sister he missed, a father who had died before he left Earth, a mother who still sent him letters that took months to arrive through official channels. He talked about nothing that seemed to matter, and somehow, listening to him, I began to feel something I did not have a word for in my own language. I told myself it was simply comfort, the comfort of a harmless companion. There were small things I noticed and dismissed because I did not yet know how to read them. The way he woke instantly, without grogginess, at even a faint sound outside our chambers, before settling back into sleep as though nothing had happened. The way he positioned himself, without seeming to think about it, between me and any doorway when we walked through unfamiliar parts of the palace. The way his eyes moved across a room quickly when we entered it, cataloging exits, cataloging people, before he ever looked at anything else. I asked him once, half joking, why he always checked the doors first. He said, "Old habit," and changed the subject before I could ask what kind of life built a habit like that. I did not press him. I told myself it was nothing. Humans were new to me, and perhaps this was simply how they behaved, cautious in strange places, nothing more sinister than that. There was a night, about 2 months into the marriage, when I woke to find him gone from our bed. I found him standing at the window, fully dressed, still and quiet, watching the courtyard below with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Not fear, something colder, something focused. "Daniel?" He turned, and the expression vanished so quickly I almost believed I had imagined it. He smiled, said he'd heard something and wanted to check, said it was probably nothing, guards patrolling, wildlife in the garden. He came back to bed. He held me the way he always did, warm and careless and easy, and I fell back asleep, telling myself the strange look on his face meant nothing at all. I did not know yet that somewhere on that same night, 3 systems away, Housemore Dry had finished drafting a plan that would end, very shortly, with blades meant for my throat. I did not know that the man sleeping beside me, the one who mispronounced honorifics and flinched at spiders and apologized for ruining dinners, had spent years of his life learning exactly what to do when blades came for people he loved. I only knew that I had married someone I believed was harmless. I was about to learn how wrong that belief could be, and how much it would cost me to keep believing it. For now, though, I only knew the quiet, the warmth of his arm around me, the soft, steady sound of his breathing, slower and calmer than mine, as if nothing in this world, or any other, could possibly threaten what we had built in 2 short months. I had never been more wrong about anything in my life, and I would not understand how wrong until the night everything changed, until the night I learned that harmless was a word I had chosen for him without ever asking whether it was true. The transport shuddered so hard that my drink spilled across the table before the first alarm even sounded, and by the time the second alarm went off, Daniel was already moving, already between me and the door, already someone I did not recognize. We had been traveling to the border colony of Vessern, a quiet outpost world where my father wanted us seen together, a small public gesture to prove the treaty was working. Nothing about the journey had felt dangerous. The transport was a mid-sized diplomatic vessel, escorted by 2 Dominion cruisers, staffed by a crew who had served my family for years. I had spent the trip half asleep against Daniel's shoulder, listening to him describe a game his sister used to play with him as children, something involving cards and terrible puns, and I remember laughing at the exact moment the ship lurched sideways. "Stay behind me," he said, and his voice had changed, not louder, flatter. Every trace of the easy, joking man I had married had disappeared in an instant, replaced by something quiet and absolutely certain. I did not stay behind him. I was a Corvain, and Corvains do not hide, and I told him so as I reached for the ceremonial blade I kept strapped beneath my formal robes for exactly this kind of occasion, useless as it likely was against modern weapons. He did not argue with me. He simply said, "Then stay close," and moved toward the door of our private cabin with a calm that made no sense given the chaos outside. Shouting, the distant, muffled sound of the ship's defense systems failing. Somewhere further down the corridor, a scream cut off too suddenly. I had trained in combat since childhood, the way all Dominion royalty did, drilled in blade work and unarmed defense by masters who had served 3 generations of my family. I considered myself capable. I considered myself dangerous, in the narrow, formal way that royal training produces. All elegant forms and practiced strikes meant for demonstration as much as survival. What I watched Daniel do in the next several minutes did not resemble anything I had been trained in. The corridor outside our cabin held 2 of the crew members I recognized, both down, both alive, but unable to rise, and past them, moving with quick, coordinated purpose, 3 armed figures in unmarked dark suits, the kind of gear that told me nothing about their allegiance and everything about their intentions. Assassins. Professional ones. The kind that Dominion houses hired when they wanted trouble without a signature attached to it. Daniel did not hesitate at the sight of them, and he did not announce himself, and he did not give them the chance to notice me before he closed the distance between us and the nearest one. I had expected, if I had expected anything at all in that frozen half-second, that he would try to talk, try to negotiate, try anything other than what he actually did, which was move. He moved the way water moves through a narrow channel, all economy, no wasted motion, and the first attacker was down before I fully understood the strike that put him there, some quick, precise use of the man's own weight against him, redirected, ended. The second one turned toward the sound, and Daniel was already inside his reach, already past the weapon meant to stop him, and within seconds that one was down too, and I stood frozen in the doorway of our cabin with my ceremonial blade still raised, useless, forgotten, watching my harmless human husband end a fight with something that looked less like combat and more like a task he had done 1,000 times before and found, if anything, tedious. The third attacker saw what had happened to the first 2 and turned his weapon toward me instead, calculating, correctly, that I was the actual target and that reaching me directly might succeed where a straight fight would not. I remember the weapon rising. I remember the strange, distant clarity that comes in moments like that, where time seems to slow just enough to notice every detail and not nearly enough to act on any of them. I remember thinking, with something close to embarrassment, that I had frozen instead of following my training, that some part of me had spent the last several seconds simply staring at my husband instead of defending myself. Daniel was between us before the weapon finished rising. I did not see exactly what happened. It occurred too fast, and I was too focused on the sudden absence of him in front of me and the sudden presence of him in front of the attacker instead, close enough that the weapon became useless, close enough that whatever training governed his movements took over completely. When it was finished, only seconds later, the corridor was quiet, except for my own breathing, which had turned ragged and uneven, and the crew members on the floor, groaning now, alive, and Daniel, standing with his back slightly to me, chest rising and falling evenly, checking the corridor beyond for further threats before he turned around. His face, when he turned, held none of the calm coldness from moments before. It held worry, immediate and entirely focused on me, both hands coming up to check that I was unharmed before he said a single word about what had just happened. "Are you hurt? Vey, look at me. Are you hurt anywhere?" I was not hurt. I told him so, though my voice did not sound entirely steady saying it. He pulled me against him for a moment, just a moment, and I felt him take one long breath, and then he released me and turned back toward the corridor, all business again, checking the fallen men for further danger, checking the crew, calling out toward the bridge to ask what had happened to the ship's defenses. I stood in the middle of the corridor, surrounded by 3 men my husband had stopped in under a minute, and felt something in my understanding of him crack cleanly in two. The rest of the ship's crew arrived moments later, security officers finally responding to the breach, weapons raised, shouting instructions that Daniel answered calmly, precisely, identifying the threat, the number of attackers, their likely entry point, all delivered in the flat, competent tone of someone reporting facts rather than someone who had just fought for his life and mine. The security officers looked at the 3 men on the floor, looked at Daniel, standing there in his simple, unremarkable clothes, without a single visible weapon, and I watched confusion cross their faces, the same confusion I felt myself. Later, once the ship had been secured and the danger confirmed past, once the Dominion cruisers had confirmed no further threats remained aboard, I sat across from Daniel in a small debriefing room while our own security officers questioned him about what had happened. I said very little. I listened. He explained the encounter calmly, described the attackers' technique, their coordination, their equipment, in a level of detail that made our security chief, a decorated veteran named Chancellor Sereth, the same man who had argued with Daniel during the treaty negotiations, lean forward with growing interest. "You identified their formation before they engaged," Sereth said slowly. "You knew how many there were before you saw them." "How?" Daniel shrugged, a small, uncomfortable motion, and said, "I used to be a soldier. You learn to read things like that." "Used to be," Sereth repeated. "For how long?" "Long enough," Daniel said, and something in his tone closed the conversation as effectively as a locked door. Sereth did not press further, though I could see he wanted to, and eventually the debriefing ended and the crew resumed preparations to continue the journey once the ship's systems were fully restored. Daniel and I were left alone in the small room, the quiet between us heavier than any silence we had shared before. "You told me you cooked badly," I said finally, because it was the only thing I could think to say, and because some absurd part of me needed to say something ordinary before I could say anything real. He laughed, short and surprised, and the tension in his shoulders eased slightly. "I do cook badly. That part was true. You did not tell me you could do that." I gestured vaguely at the corridor beyond the door, at the memory of what had happened there. "Any of that." His smile faded. He looked down at his hands for a moment, before looking back up at me, and when he spoke, his voice had lost its usual lightness. "I didn't think it mattered anymore. I'm not that person. Not really. Not the way I used to be. I left that life behind when I came here. It clearly still exists somewhere inside you. It exists because it kept us both safe 20 minutes ago, he said quietly. I'm not going to apologize for that. I had not asked him to apologize. I did not know, in that moment, what I had wanted from him at all, only that the man I had decided was harmless had just proven, without any visible effort, that he was capable of stopping 3 trained attackers in under a minute, and had done so without hesitation, without fear, and with a competence that suggested this was not the first time he had needed to. Who were they? I asked instead. The attackers. Professional, he said. Trained, coordinated, well-equipped. Someone paid for this, and paid well. House Mordrai, I said, though it was not truly a question. My father had mentioned, weeks earlier, that House Mordrai had opposed the treaty from the beginning, had argued in council that alliance with humanity would weaken the Dominion's standing among the other great houses, had lost that argument publicly and humiliatingly when my father overruled them. Daniel's expression sharpened at the name, filing it away, and I watched him do it, watched him turn a piece of information into something calculated and careful, and understood that whatever version of him I had married during those quiet, easy months, another version had just resurfaced, and I did not yet know which one was more real. I used to be a soldier, he had said, not which war, not for how long, not what, exactly, that life had required of him, or what it had cost him, or why a man capable of what I had just witnessed had ever agreed to leave his own world and marry a stranger from a species he barely understood. I realized, sitting in that quiet debriefing room with my hands still faintly trembling, that I had married a man I did not actually know at all. I asked him, later that night, once we had returned to our cabin and the ship had resumed its journey under heavier escort, whether there was more he had not told me. He sat on the edge of our bed, elbows on his knees, and was quiet for a long moment before answering. "There's a lot I haven't told you," he admitted. "Not because I wanted to hide it from you, because some of it isn't easy to say, and because I hoped I wouldn't have to bring any of it here, into this life, into us. And now? Now I think it's already here, whether I brought it or not," he said, and something in his voice sounded tired in a way I had not heard from him before, tired in a way that suggested this was not the first difficult moment he had faced, and would very likely not be the last. I did not sleep well that night. I lay awake listening to his breathing beside me, steady and even as always, and found myself watching him differently than I had before, not with fear, not exactly, but with a new and unsettling awareness that the man beside me held depths I had not begun to understand, and that somewhere out among the stars, people who wished me harm had just learned something important about what protecting me would actually require. They would not stop after one failed attempt. I understood that much even then. House Mordrai did not survive centuries of Dominion politics by accepting failure quietly, and I suspected, correctly, that whatever came next would arrive with far more force than 3 attackers on a diplomatic transport. What I did not yet understand was how much more force Daniel himself represented, or how many people, scattered across a world I had never visited, were quietly beginning to take notice that someone had just tried, and failed, to reach someone they considered one of their own. News of the attack reached Earth before it reached most of my father's own council, and that fact alone told me something important about the world my husband had come from, something I had not understood until then. Dominion communication moved through official channels, slow and layered with protocol. Messages passed from officer to officer, reviewed and approved before reaching anyone with authority to act. Human communication, at least the kind that mattered to Daniel, seemed to move through no channel I could identify at all, and yet it arrived faster than anything my own government could manage. 3 days after the attack on the transport, a small, unmarked human vessel requested docking clearance at our homeworld, Ashven, without any prior diplomatic notice, without any of the formal exchanges that governed contact between our species. My father's Security Council was furious. I remember Chancellor Sereth storming into the reception hall, demanding to know how a foreign vessel had approached so close to the capital without triggering a single alert from our monitoring stations. Daniel, standing beside me, did not look surprised at all. He looked, if anything, faintly amused and quietly resigned, like a man watching an old friend do something entirely predictable. "That would be Owen," he said, mostly to himself. The vessel docked without incident, scanned clean of any weapons our systems could detect, and a small group of humans disembarked, 4 of them, dressed in plain, practical clothing similar to what Daniel usually wore. They moved through the reception hall with none of the nervous uncertainty I remembered from Daniel's first visit. No fidgeting, no awkward bows, no translator devices clicking uncertainly on their wrists. They walked like they had been in this hall before, or in 100 halls just like it, and they looked at the Dominion guards lining the walls with polite, careful attention that felt less like respect and more like assessment. The one in front, a tall woman with short dark hair and sharp, watchful eyes, spotted Daniel and crossed the hall directly toward him, ignoring the protocol officers attempting to intercept her. "You look terrible," she said, in place of any greeting. "Good to see you too, Grace," Daniel said, and something in his posture shifted, relaxed slightly, in a way I had only seen happen around me before that moment. Grace Bennett, I would learn later, had served with Daniel for 6 years before he left for the Dominion. Behind her stood Owen Vance, broad-shouldered and quiet, who greeted Daniel with a firm grip on the shoulder and a look that carried more weight than any words could have. Behind them, a woman named Lily Turner and a man named Henry Voss, both younger, both watching the room with the same careful, cataloging attention Grace had shown. They did not look at me the way most people did, the way the Dominion Council did, with careful deference to my rank. They looked at me the way someone evaluates a piece of equipment, checking for damage, and I understood, with growing unease, that whatever authority had sent them here, it had not sent them to honor a princess. It had sent them to protect an asset, and that asset, apparently, was Daniel, and by extension, me. "We heard about the transport," Owen said, his voice low and even. "Command wanted eyes here, immediately." "Command?" I repeated, looking at Daniel. "Whose command? You told me you left the military." Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, the first sign of discomfort I had seen from him since his friends arrived. "I did leave. This isn't official. It's—" He looked at Grace, as if hoping she might explain it better than he could. "It's family," Grace said simply, looking directly at me now, her eyes appraising in a way that made me feel, briefly, like the outsider in my own palace. "Daniel doesn't get to just disappear because he got married. Not after everything. We don't work that way." I did not understand what everything meant. Not yet, though the word sat heavy in the air, carrying weight I could not translate. My father's council watched this exchange with growing alarm, unused to foreign visitors speaking so freely, so informally, in a hall built for careful diplomatic language. Sereth, in particular, seemed to bristle at the casual way Grace addressed a princess of the Dominion, though something in her posture, something coiled and ready beneath the calm surface, made even Sereth hesitate to reprimand her directly. My father requested an audience with the visitors that same evening, and I attended, curious and increasingly unsettled by what I was learning about the world my husband had left behind. The conversation began formally enough, my father offering traditional greetings, Grace responding with practiced, if slightly clipped, courtesy. But the true substance of the meeting came only after the formalities ended, once my father asked, directly, what authority had sent them here without prior notice. "No authority sent us, Your Majesty," Owen said. "We came because Daniel is one of ours, and someone tried to kill him. That's not something we wait for orders to respond to." "He was not the target," my father said. "My daughter was." "With respect," Grace said, "they were on the same transport. Anyone shooting at her was shooting at him too, whether they meant to or not. That makes it our concern." My father studied them for a long moment, and I watched him recalculate something behind his eyes, some assumption about humanity he had clearly been operating under since the treaty was signed. You speak as though your government does not control your movements, as though you act independently of your leaders. We're not exactly government, Henry Voss said, speaking for the first time, his voice quiet but certain. We're something adjacent to it, something that exists because a long time ago, humanity learned the hard way that waiting for official channels to authorize protecting your own people gets those people hurt. We don't wait anymore. I watched my father absorb this, watched the careful, practiced diplomat's mask he wore settle into something more genuinely uncertain. He had spent months treating the treaty with humanity as a matter of managing a newly discovered, technologically junior species, offering them protection and structure in exchange for their resources and cooperation. I watched him begin to understand, in that room, that the structure he imagined might not exist the way he believed it did, that the species he had been managing carried within it currents and loyalties that operated entirely outside his understanding. And Daniel, my father asked slowly, is significant to this network. This family, as you called it. Grace glanced at Daniel before answering, something unreadable passing between them. Daniel is significant to a lot of people, Your Majesty. That's not something he talks about, and I'm not going to be the one who does it for him. But I'll tell you this much. Whoever sent those attackers after your daughter picked the single worst possible person to accidentally put in the crossfire. Daniel said nothing throughout most of this exchange, sitting quietly with an expression I had come to recognize as deliberate stillness, the same calm mask he wore in the moments before violence. I studied him from across the room, trying to reconcile the man who had cooked disastrous meals and apologized for flinching at spiders with whatever version of him his old comrades were describing in careful, respectful half-sentences. After the audience ended, I found him alone on the balcony outside our chambers, the same balcony where I had once stood wondering what kind of harmless life I was being given. He did not turn when I joined him, though he clearly knew I was there. "They're not wrong to worry," he said quietly, before I could ask anything. "Mordrai isn't going to stop because the first attempt failed. People like that rarely do." "Your friends called you significant," I said. "Grace said you're significant to a lot of people. What did she mean?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the darkening sky, at the distant lights of Ashvin's capital spread beneath us. "I spent a long time doing work that most people never hear about," he said finally. "Work that mattered, work that saved lives, work that also required me to become someone I'm not entirely proud of. When the Dominion contact happened, when they were looking for someone to send as part of the delegation, someone with combat experience and diplomatic training, my name came up. I said yes, because I was tired of that life, and because I thought maybe this could be a way to leave it behind for good. But it followed you here. It always follows," he said. "That's the thing nobody tells you about that kind of work. It doesn't end just because you want it to. The people you served with don't stop being your people just because you walked away from the uniform. And apparently, neither do the enemies you made along the way." I thought about House Mordrai, about the careful, calculated way Daniel had absorbed their name during the debriefing, filing it away like a piece of a puzzle he intended to finish assembling. I thought about Grace's words, about someone picking the worst possible person to put in the crossfire, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. What enemies, Daniel? What did you do, before this, that would make House Mordray's attack feel personal to people I've never met? He turned to look at me then, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw something close to genuine hesitation in his expression, a weighing of what to say and what to withhold that felt entirely unlike the easy openness he had always shown me. "There's a reason my service record isn't something the Dominion was allowed to see in full," he said carefully. "There's a reason humanity agreed to send me here specifically, instead of someone with a cleaner history. It wasn't an accident, Vey. Someone on my side wanted a person with my particular skills stationed here, watching, in case something like this happened. You were sent here to be a weapon, I said slowly, understanding arriving in pieces, each one heavier than the last. Not a husband, a weapon your people placed inside my father's palace. I was sent here to be both, he said, and his voice carried something raw and honest that cut through my growing anger more effectively than any argument could have. I didn't choose to fall for you as some kind of assignment, Vey. That part is real. All of it is real. But yes, part of why I was chosen for this posting is because someone back home believed the Dominion's new alliance might attract exactly the kind of trouble it just did, and they wanted someone here who could handle it if it came. I stood there on the balcony, absorbing the shape of my own life rearranging itself around a truth I had not asked for and could not now unknow. My marriage, which I had believed was purely political convenience wrapped around an unexpected, genuine affection, had apparently also been a calculated placement of a weapon inside my father's household, and the affection, however real Daniel claimed it to be, existed alongside that calculation rather than instead of it. "Does my father know this?" I asked. "Did he agree to it, knowing what you actually were?" "I don't know what your father was told," Daniel admitted. "That's not something I was part of. My handling was separate from the diplomatic negotiations. But I'd guess, given how surprised he looked tonight, that he knew less than he thought he did." We stood together in silence for a long time after that, the distance between us feeling wider than it had ever felt before, despite standing close enough to touch. I did not know, in that moment, whether to feel betrayed or reassured, whether the revelation that my harmless husband was in fact a carefully placed asset with a violent, hidden history made me safer or simply more thoroughly caught inside a game I had never been allowed to see the full rules of. "I should have told you sooner," Daniel said eventually, quietly. "I told myself I was protecting you by not saying anything, but honestly, I think I was protecting myself from having to watch you look at me the way you're looking at me right now." I did not know how to answer that honestly, so I said nothing at all, and eventually he went inside, leaving me alone on the balcony with the weight of everything I had just learned, and the growing uncomfortable certainty that whatever came next, whatever House Mordrai planned in response to their failed attempt, I would need every version of Daniel that existed, the harmless one and the dangerous one both, if I hoped to survive it. The following days brought a strange new rhythm to the palace, Daniel's old comrades settling into guest quarters with the quiet efficiency of people accustomed to unfamiliar environments, integrating themselves into the palace's security rotations despite Sereth's obvious discomfort at foreign operatives moving freely through Dominion territory. My father, to his credit, adapted quickly once the initial shock passed, recognizing, correctly, that whatever resentment he felt about being kept uninformed mattered less than the additional protection these humans clearly offered. I spent those days watching Daniel differently than before, watching the way he moved through security briefings with an authority the Dominion officers deferred to almost immediately, watching the way his friends treated him with a mixture of familiarity and respect that suggested a history far deeper than casual service alongside one another. I began, slowly, to understand that the man I had married was not simply a soldier who had left his old life behind, but something closer to a legend within whatever circles his old comrades operated in, spoken of carefully, respected instinctively, protected fiercely. I asked Grace, one evening, while Daniel was occupied with security planning, what exactly Daniel had done to earn that kind of loyalty. She considered the question for a long moment before answering. "There was an operation, a few years back," she said carefully, choosing her words like they were dangerous objects she needed to handle with care. "Things went wrong, badly wrong. Daniel got most of us out alive when the plan fell apart, made calls that cost him things he's never really talked about since. People don't forget something like that. We don't forget people who show up for us when it matters most. And we definitely don't forget people who paid the price to make sure we came home." "What price?" I asked. Grace looked at me for a long moment, something sympathetic and sad in her expression. "That's his to tell, not mine, But I'll say this much. Whatever you're learning about him now, however strange or unsettling it feels, the man underneath all of it is still the same one who married you. That part was never a lie. I held on to those words in the days that followed, as reports began arriving of increased Mordrai activity along the border territories, as Daniel's expression grew more focused and distant with each new piece of intelligence, as the quiet, easy rhythm of our early marriage gave way to something tense and watchful. The entire palace bracing for whatever House Mordrai intended to do next, now that their first attempt had failed and their target had proven far more capable than anyone had anticipated. I did not yet know how large that next attempt would be, or how close it would bring us all to losing everything we had only just begun to build together. I only knew that the harmless man I had married had disappeared somewhere in the space of a few short days, replaced by someone far more complicated, far more dangerous, and, despite everything, someone I found myself trusting more completely than I ever had before. The attack came 11 days later, at an hour when House Mordrai clearly believed the palace would be least prepared, and it came with a force that made the transport assault look like the small, tentative gesture it had actually been. I woke to Daniel's hand on my shoulder, his voice low and urgent in a way I had only heard once before, and the moment I opened my eyes I understood, from his expression alone, that this night was different from anything we had faced so far. "They're here," he said. "A lot of them. Get dressed, quickly, and stay with Grace." I did not argue. Whatever hesitation I had carried in the corridor of the transport had burned away in the days since, replaced by a hard, practical understanding that survival mattered more than pride, and that Daniel's instructions, in moments like this, came from a place of genuine expertise I did not possess. I dressed quickly, while he pulled on his own gear, equipment his friends had brought with them from Earth, unfamiliar and efficient, nothing like the ceremonial armor Dominion soldiers wore. Outside our chambers, the palace had already erupted into controlled chaos, alarms sounding through every corridor, Dominion guards moving in practiced formation toward the outer walls, and beneath it all, a steady stream of updates crackling through devices on the wrists of Daniel's companions, coordinating a response with a speed and precision that outpaced even our own trained security forces. "Full assault," Owen reported, jogging alongside us as we moved through the palace toward the command center Sereth had established. They breached the outer perimeter through the eastern approach. Numbers suggest this isn't just an assassination attempt anymore. This looks like they're trying to make a statement. "How large a force?" Daniel asked. "Large enough that Sereth's people are already stretched thin," Owen said grimly. "This was planned for weeks, maybe longer. They knew our rotations, knew the weak points in the perimeter. Someone gave them detailed information." Daniel's jaw tightened at that, the implication of an informer inside the palace settling over the group like a physical weight, though no one paused to discuss it further, the immediate crisis demanding all their attention. We reached the command center to find Sereth directing forces across a holographic display of the palace grounds, his usual stiff composure replaced by the focused intensity of a man managing a genuine crisis. My father stood nearby, dressed hastily, his expression a careful mask over what I recognized as real fear. Not for himself, I understood, but for me. "Ve Lara," he said, crossing to me quickly. "You should be in the shelter with the rest of the household." "I'm not hiding while people die defending this palace," I said, and something in my tone must have carried enough conviction that he did not argue further, though his expression made clear he disagreed. The Eastern Gardens, where the initial breach had occurred, had already become a contested space. Dominion guards holding a defensive line against attackers who fought with a discipline that suggested extensive, expensive training. I watched the holographic display shift as reports came in, red markers representing enemy positions creeping steadily closer to the palace's inner structure despite our forces' best efforts to hold them back. Daniel studied the display for only a few seconds before speaking, his voice carrying an authority that made even Sereth pause and listen. "Your formation's too spread out. You're trying to hold every approach equally, which means you're strong nowhere. Pull back your eastern line to the garden wall, funnel them through the archway there, and concentrate your strength at that choke point instead of spreading thin, trying to stop them everywhere at once." Serath hesitated only a moment before nodding, relaying the adjusted orders through his communication device, and I watched, with something between awe and unease, as the red markers on the display began, slowly, to falter against our reorganized defense. "You've done this before," I said quietly, watching him work. "More times than I'd like," he said, without looking away from the display. The fighting continued for nearly 2 hours. The palace grounds transformed into something unrecognizable. The quiet gardens, where I had once found Daniel apologizing to a startled void spider, now a battleground lit by emergency lighting and the flash of defensive weapons fire. I remained in the command center through most of it, watching the display, listening to reports, feeling useless in a way that gnawed at me even as I understood, rationally, that my presence on the actual grounds would only create another liability for the people fighting to protect the palace. It was Grace who eventually voiced what I suspected everyone had begun to fear. "This is too coordinated for a house trying to make a point," she said, studying the tactical display over Serath's shoulder. "This is a house trying to actually win. They're not just sending a message anymore. They came here to take the palace." My father's expression, hearing that, went pale in a way I had never seen from him before. House Mordrai launching a symbolic assault to embarrass the crown was one thing, an acceptable, if dangerous, risk of political life among the great houses. An actual attempt to seize the palace itself represented something else entirely, an act of open rebellion that would fracture the fragile balance of power holding the Dominion together. "They're gambling everything on this," Daniel said slowly, working through the implications as he spoke. "If this succeeds, they consolidate enough power to survive whatever retaliation follows. If it fails, House Mordrai ceases to exist," my father finished grimly. "Which means they will not stop until they have either succeeded or exhausted every resource they possess trying." The assault reached its most dangerous point roughly 90 minutes in, when a secondary force, one our defenses had not anticipated, breached the palace through an underground access route that Serath admitted, with visible shame, should have been sealed and monitored far more carefully than it had been. This second force moved with clear purpose directly toward the palace's inner chambers, bypassing the main fighting entirely, and I understood, watching the display update with growing horror, that this second force was not attempting to win the larger battle at all. They were coming for me directly. Daniel understood it in the same instant I did, and he moved before Serath had even finished processing the new information, calling for Owen and Henry to follow him, instructing Grace to keep me in the command center under heavy guard, his voice carrying none of the warmth I associated with him and all of the flat, focused certainty I had first glimpsed on the transport weeks earlier. "Daniel," I started, but he was already moving toward the door. He paused just long enough to look back at me, and in that brief moment, something passed between us that needed no translation device, no careful diplomatic language, nothing but the simple, direct understanding of two people who had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, come to genuinely need one another. "I'm not losing you tonight," he said. "Trust me." I did, completely, without reservation, in a way that surprised me even as I felt it. He left with Owen and Henry, moving toward the access point the secondary force intended to use, and I spent the following 20 minutes in the command center watching the display with an intensity that made my chest ache, tracking the small markers representing Daniel and his companions as they intercepted the second force in a narrow service corridor deep beneath the palace, a location chosen, I understood later, precisely because it prevented the attackers from spreading out or using their numbers effectively. Grace stood beside me throughout, watching the same display with a calm I found impossible to replicate, though I noticed her hand had drifted to the weapon at her side, ready, despite her outward composure. "He'll be fine," she said quietly, more reassurance than certainty. This is what he's actually good at. Better than anyone I've ever served with. Whatever you've seen of him so far, this is where he's most himself. The confrontation in the underground corridor lasted less than 10 minutes, though it felt, watching from the command center, like the longest 10 minutes of my life. When it ended, the reports came through quickly, relayed by Owen's steady, professional voice through the communication channel. Secondary force neutralized. No further threat to the inner chambers. Minor injuries only. Nothing severe. I did not fully breathe again until Daniel walked back into the command center himself, moving with the same measured calm as before, though I noticed, this time, a shallow cut along his forearm that he had not bothered to properly treat yet, and a tiredness in his expression that went deeper than simple physical exhaustion. I crossed the room and embraced him before he could say anything at all, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke, the sounds of the ongoing battle outside fading into something distant and unimportant compared to the simple fact that he had returned to me. "You're hurt," I said finally, pulling back enough to look at the cut on his arm. "It's nothing," he said, though he allowed me to examine it more closely, his usual protests about worrying too much, noticeably absent. "We stopped them before they got anywhere near you. That's what matters." The main battle in the gardens continued for another hour before House Mordrei's remaining forces, recognizing their assault had failed on every front, began a hasty, disorganized retreat, abandoning equipment and, in several cases, wounded fighters in their haste to escape before Dominion reinforcements from neighboring territories arrived. Serath's forces pursued only far enough to confirm the retreat was genuine, wisely choosing not to overextend themselves chasing a defeated enemy through unfamiliar terrain in the dark. By dawn, the palace grounds had settled into an uneasy quiet, medical teams moving between the wounded, security forces securing captured equipment and prisoners, and the full scale of the night's events beginning to sink in across the exhausted household. My father convened an emergency council session almost immediately, though I attended only briefly before exhaustion finally caught up with me, the adrenaline that had carried me through the long night draining away all at once, leaving me hollow and shaking in its wake. Daniel found me afterward in our chambers, sitting on the edge of the bed we shared, staring at nothing in particular, and he settled beside me without a word, simply present, simply there, in a way that felt more valuable than any explanation or reassurance he could have offered. "They tried to take everything from us tonight," I said eventually. "Not just my life, everything, the palace, the treaty, all of it." "And they failed," Daniel said quietly, "because you had people willing to stand between you and that outcome. That's not nothing, Vey. That's everything, actually. How many times has this happened to you before?" I asked. "How many nights like this one, before I ever knew you existed?" He was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the same careful weight he seemed to give every question about his past. "Enough that I stopped counting a long time ago," he admitted finally. "Enough that I genuinely believed, when I agreed to come here, that this part of my life was finished. I was wrong about that. I think some part of me always knew I might be wrong about that." "Do you regret it?" I asked. "Coming here, marrying me, bringing all of this back into your life?" He turned to look at me then, and whatever exhaustion and tension had defined his expression through the long night softened, just slightly, into something gentler, more honest than anything the strategic, focused version of him had shown during the battle. "No," he said simply, "not for a single moment. Whatever this life costs me, whatever old enemies it drags back into the light, I would choose it again, without hesitation. You're worth every bit of it." I did not have words adequate to answer that, so I simply leaned into him, letting the exhaustion of the night finally overtake me, trusting, for the first time completely, that whatever came next, whatever House Mordrei attempted in retaliation for their catastrophic failure, the man beside me would face it without flinching, the same way he had faced everything since the moment those first attackers appeared on the transport weeks earlier. I did not yet know that House Mordrei's defeat that night would force a reckoning far larger than either of us anticipated, one that would require Daniel to answer, publicly and completely, for exactly what kind of man my father's council had unknowingly welcomed into the heart of the Dominion. The full council convened 3 days after the attack, and this time the summons named Daniel directly, rather than including him as an afterthought beside me. My father's advisors wanted answers. So did the other great houses, several of whom sent representatives to observe the proceedings, drawn by rumors already spreading across Dominion space about a single human who had, apparently, personally ended House Mordrei's attempt at rebellion within the palace's own underground corridors. I wanted to attend beside him, but Daniel asked me, gently, to let him face this part alone. "They need to see me answer for myself," he said, the morning of the council session, adjusting the plain, dark clothing he had chosen instead of anything ceremonial. "If I walk in there with you beside me, it becomes about protecting the princess's husband. I need it to be about something else. I need them to understand what actually happened here, and why." I did not fully understand what he meant until later, when Grace, Owen, and the others quietly explained that Daniel intended to tell my father's council things about himself that he had never told me, that he had perhaps never told anyone outside the small circle of people who had served alongside him. I spent the hours of the council session in our chambers, restless, unable to focus on anything, until finally a servant arrived to inform me that the session had concluded and that my father wished to see me in his private study. I found Daniel there already, standing near the window, his expression unreadable, and my father seated behind his desk, looking older than I had ever seen him look, the weight of the last several days etched clearly into his features. "Sit, Valara," my father said, and something in his tone made me obey without question. What followed was an explanation delivered mostly by my father, occasionally supplemented by Daniel in careful, measured additions, and it reshaped, once again, everything I believed I understood about the man I had married. Years before the Dominion ever made contact with humanity, Daniel had served in something my father's council struggled to translate accurately into our own concepts of military structure. A small, highly specialized unit tasked with responding to threats too sensitive or too dangerous for conventional forces to handle. The operation Grace had referenced weeks earlier, the one that had gone catastrophically wrong, had left Daniel the sole surviving commander of his unit, responsible for decisions that had saved most of his people while costing others their lives. Decisions that had earned him both deep loyalty from those he had saved and deep enmity from powerful interests whose plans he had disrupted in the process. When first contact with the Dominion occurred, and when intelligence suggested that certain factions within Dominion politics might view the emerging alliance as a threat worth violently opposing, Daniel's superiors had specifically selected him for the diplomatic posting, not despite his complicated, dangerous history, but because of it. They needed someone capable of protecting the alliance from exactly the kind of internal threat House Mordrei had ultimately proven to be, and Daniel, tired of his old life but unable to fully abandon the sense of duty that had defined it, had agreed. "I did not know the full extent of this when I approved the marriage," my father admitted, and the admission clearly cost him something, an emperor confessing to his daughter that he had not controlled every variable he believed he controlled. I knew Daniel carried military experience. I did not know the scope of what that experience actually represented, or how directly it would come to matter. "Would it have changed your decision," I asked, "if you had known?" My father considered the question seriously before answering. "I do not know," he said finally. "Perhaps I would have hesitated, perhaps I would have seen only the danger and missed the value, the way I nearly did until 3 nights ago demonstrated it so clearly. I cannot say with certainty. What I can say is that I am grateful, now, for the outcome, whatever uncertainty led us here." Daniel, throughout this explanation, remained quiet and watchful, occasionally offering a correction or clarification, but mostly allowing my father to carry the weight of the conversation, and I understood, watching him, that this restraint was deliberate, a careful choice to let the Dominion's own leadership process what had happened in their own way, without him pushing or defending himself more than necessary. "The council session," I said finally, turning to him. "What happened? What did you tell them?" "The truth," he said simply. "As much of it as I could share, without compromising things that aren't mine alone to reveal. I told them what House Mordrai attempted, why it failed, and what would happen to anyone who tried something similar in the future." "And how did they respond?" Something almost like a tired smile crossed his face. "About as well as you'd expect a room full of proud aristocrats to respond to being told that the human they'd been quietly dismissing as harmless had just personally dismantled an armed rebellion in their own basement. Some of them were grateful, some of them were furious that they hadn't been told sooner. A few of them, I think, are genuinely afraid of me now, which honestly might be the most useful outcome of all this." My father's expression suggested he agreed with that assessment more than he wanted to admit aloud. The days following the council session brought significant changes to the political landscape of the Dominion. House Mordrai, its rebellion exposed and thoroughly crushed, faced a tribunal that stripped away most of its territorial holdings and political influence, a punishment severe enough to serve as an unmistakable warning to any other house considering similar action. Lord Caelric Mordrai himself, the architect of the failed rebellion, was placed under permanent house arrest, his ambitions ended as completely and finally as the plot he had orchestrated. More significantly, the treaty between the Dominion and Earth, which had begun as a cautious, carefully balanced arrangement between a powerful empire and a barely understood newcomer, transformed almost overnight into something far more substantial. My father, having witnessed firsthand exactly what humanity was capable of when properly motivated, no longer viewed Earth as a junior partner requiring careful management. He viewed it, instead, as something closer to an equal, a species whose capabilities had been dramatically underestimated by everyone, including, I suspected, humanity's own diplomatic representatives who had initially approached the negotiations with such careful, almost apologetic restraint. Daniel's role in these renegotiated terms proved unexpectedly significant. My father, recognizing the value of maintaining direct, trusted communication with whatever network Daniel represented, requested that he serve as a formal liaison between the Dominion Crown and Earth's less official but clearly influential defense networks, a role Daniel accepted with visible reluctance, torn between his genuine desire to leave that world behind and his equally genuine understanding that his unique position made him I told myself I was done with this kind of work, he admitted to me one evening, weeks after the attack, as we sat together in the garden that had so recently been a battlefield, now quietly restored, the void spiders that had once startled him wandering peacefully through the undergrowth nearby. I keep telling myself that, and circumstances keep proving me wrong. "Perhaps it is not circumstance," I said. "Perhaps you are simply someone who cannot walk away from people who need protecting, no matter how much you might want to." He considered that for a long moment, watching the strange, beautiful sunset colors of Ashven's sky stretch across the horizon. "Maybe," he admitted, "or maybe I just got lucky, marrying someone worth protecting in the first place." I thought back, in that quiet moment, to the man I had first met in a treaty room built for careful, distant diplomacy, apologizing for a bow he had performed badly, insisting he would improve with practice. I thought about the small, ordinary details I had mistaken for the entirety of who he was: the bad cooking, the flinching at unfamiliar wildlife, the quiet, unassuming manner that had convinced me, so thoroughly and so wrongly, that I had married someone harmless. I understood, now, that harmless had never been the right word. Gentle, perhaps. Careful with the people he loved, certainly. But harmless suggested an absence of danger entirely, and what I had actually married was something far more complicated, a man who carried genuine danger within him and had chosen, deliberately and consistently, to direct that danger only toward anyone who threatened the people under his protection. Grace and the others remained at the palace for several more weeks, helping establish new security protocols alongside Serath's forces, a partnership that began with obvious tension and gradually, grudgingly, developed into something resembling mutual respect. I spent those weeks learning more about the world Daniel had come from, about the strange, informal networks of loyalty that bound humanity's most capable protectors together, about the price such people paid for the safety they provided others, a price measured not just in physical danger, but in the quiet, permanent loneliness of carrying experiences most people around them could never fully understand. "Does it get easier?" I asked Grace, during one of our final conversations before she and the others prepared to return to Earth. "Loving someone who carries that kind of weight?" She considered the question seriously, the way she seemed to consider most things. "Not easier, exactly," she said, "but it becomes something you understand better over time. You learn which silences mean he's thinking through old memories, and which ones just mean he's tired. You learn to recognize the difference between him protecting you from danger and him protecting you from his own past, and you learn, eventually, that sometimes the second kind of protection needs to be gently refused, because carrying that weight alone isn't actually good for him, no matter how much he might insist otherwise. I held on to that advice in the months that followed, as Daniel and I settled into a version of our marriage that felt more honest than anything we had shared before the attacks. One built not on the comfortable illusion of harmlessness, but on a clearer, more complete understanding of exactly who we each were, dangers and all. I learned, slowly, to ask him directly about the memories that occasionally shadowed his expression, rather than pretending not to notice them. He learned, in turn, to answer more openly, sharing pieces of his past he had once guarded carefully, trusting me with weight he had previously carried entirely alone. House Mordrei's fall sent ripples through Dominion politics that continued long after the immediate crisis ended, other great houses recalculating their own positions in light of what had happened, most concluding that open hostility toward the human alliance carried risks far greater than any of them had previously assumed. The treaty, once a fragile, carefully balanced document that satisfied no one completely, evolved into something both sides genuinely valued, strengthened rather than weakened by the crisis that had nearly destroyed it. My father, in a private conversation some months later, admitted something that surprised me with its honesty. "Well, I chose your marriage as a political calculation," he said. "I saw a barely understood species, a treaty that needed strengthening, and a convenient solution that would bind our interests together without costing me anything I valued more highly. I did not expect to gain a son I have come to genuinely respect. I did not expect the alliance to become something I believe in, rather than simply something I manage. Your marriage accomplished far more than I ever intended it to." I did not tell him, in that moment, that I had once viewed the marriage with the same cold calculation he had, that I had once believed I was accepting a harmless, unremarkable companion as the price of political necessity. Some truths belonged only to Daniel and me, private history that had transformed, through crisis and honesty, into something neither of us had expected when we first stood together in that formal treaty room, strangers bound by obligation rather than choice. I think of that first meeting sometimes, the awkward bow, the crooked, apologetic smile, the quiet insistence that he would get better at Dominion customs with practice. I think about how completely I misjudged him, how thoroughly I mistook gentleness for weakness, quiet competence for harmlessness, and I wonder, occasionally, whether House Mordrei made the same mistake, whether they looked at the same unremarkable human I once saw and concluded, wrongly and fatally, that he represented no genuine threat to their ambitions. They learned otherwise, in the end, the way I did, though their lesson cost them everything they had built across generations of careful political maneuvering, while mine cost me only the comfortable, convenient illusion I had constructed around a man who never actually asked me to see him as harmless in the first place. That illusion had always been mine alone, a story I told myself because it was easier than acknowledging the complicated, dangerous, deeply loyal man standing quietly beside me, waiting patiently for me to eventually see him clearly. I see him clearly now, not as harmless, and not, despite everything he has done, as someone I fear. I see him as exactly what he is, a man who carries genuine danger within him and chooses, every single day, to direct that danger only toward whatever threatens the people he loves, a man capable of terrible things who has decided, deliberately and consistently, to use that capability only in defense of gentleness, of quiet mornings in gardens once turned briefly into battlefields, of a marriage that began as political convenience and became, against every reasonable expectation, something genuinely worth protecting. House Mordrai thought they understood exactly what they were facing when they moved against the Dominion crown that night. They believed they faced a princess with limited practical defenses and a human consort too insignificant to factor seriously into their calculations. They were wrong on both counts, though I suspect the second mistake cost them far more dearly than the first. I no longer make that same mistake. I know now exactly who stands beside me, and I have never, in all the time since, felt safer for knowing it.